Hello, everyone. I'm Professor Kazin, and welcome to this course I created on discriminatory systems, economic inequality, and the wire. I'm going to tell you a lot about the course, and I'm going to go through the introduction lectures right now. So first, let me just talk a little bit about the inspiration here for the course. Basically, I'm a massive fan of the wire, and I decided to make a course that explores the same things, but in economic terms. So we're going to explore economic inequality and discriminatory systems the same way that they're portrayed in the wire themselves. Now, the way I structure lectures is I'm going to have you watch episodes of The Wire prior to the lecture itself, and I'm going to relate a lot of the materials, a lot of the economics that I discussed back to those episodes, and use it as a case study for the academic material I'm going to present. All right, well, then let's get started. So, to begin, we want to introduce the audience to economics. We're going to start basically from the beginning. We're going to introduce you to markets, which are the cornerstone of economics, at least in capitalism. And well, that's what we're going to study. We're mostly going to look into America, although we do have some very interesting segues in this course into the economics in Africa and other developing nations, as well as some European nations that tend to be shining examples in one thing or another. We're also going to introduce you to direct discrimination in this lecture. So to start, we're going to start with the foundations of economics, of course. And those are basically that, okay, well, people act logically in the way you'd expect. Decision makers respond to incentives. They act in their own self-interest. So a seller, they're only going to make a product, they're only going to sell something if it's a profitable venture for them. They're not going to waste their money or their time otherwise. And a buyer, they're only ever going to buy a product if they're interested in it, if they feel it's going to value them in some way or benefit them in some way. In economics, we call this as both parties maximize their own welfare. Sellers, they maximize profit, which typically we correspond exactly to their welfare, their well-being, their happiness, if you want to call it that. And buyers maximize this thing that we call surplus, although there's many different names for it. Sometimes it's just called purely utility. Other times it's called net value or net benefit. We're just going to do the very simple version, which comes from basically microeconomics 101 or macroeconomics 101. And that is sellers, their profits just going to be defined as the price of the product that they sell minus the cost. Buyers, they're just simply going to have their surplus represented as their utility or their value of a product minus the price that they pay to get access to that product. And we'll notice one thing, this is basically a mathematical problem. The sellers, how can they be as well off as possible? How can they be as profitable as possible in this market? How can the buyers be as well off as possible in this market? Both those mathematical equations that these parties would try and solve, they involve price. So this is the thing that links buyers to sellers, and that's how they talk, essentially. And this is what brings markets together. Markets, they work through buyer-seller communication via changes into price. And that's what our next few slides are going to deal with. So we're going to talk a little bit about this price communication. Not directly, okay, they just shout dollar numbers back at one another. They just change the price until everything's satisfied, until we have a market equilibrium. And to discuss this, we're really going to stay almost completely within the realm of perfectly competitive markets. We do have some deviations from it in the course, but mostly we're going to be looking at what we consider perfectly competitive markets with some caveats. So let's describe this thing that's basically, you've heard of it if you're interested in economics whatsoever, or if you've taken an economics course. So perfectly competitive markets, they're these great things for a couple of reasons that we talk about in a few slides, but they have some assumptions here. The first is that there's many buyers and sellers. Technically, it's infinitely many. The second is that there's no barriers to entry or exit. So anyone can buy in the market, anyone can sell in the market, and anyone can stop selling in the market, anyone can stop buying in the market. And this one that's very important that isn't usually mentioned in the one-on-one classes is that there's no transaction costs. And these are things that are really, really, really important. We're going to talk about them a lot more in the second lecture, in the next lecture in the series. And for now, we're going to have a simple definition. Transaction cost, it assumes that there's no real time cost. You don't have to sit around and wait for a purchase. It's instantaneous. So you can adjust your behavior on the fly, on the go. And a very big one is that there's no fee for bargaining. There's no what we call tort costs, which are basically paying lawyers lots and lots of money. So lawyer fees is tort cost formally. I guess time spent and tax shouldn't be in this because they're not technically tort costs. But tort cost is the biggest fee for bargaining typically. One thing that is mentioned in the 101 classes that isn't necessarily need to be true, you can easily do away with this assumption, and it's not truly an assumption of a perfectly competitive market. That is that there's homogeneous products. So you can have heterogeneous products and still have a perfectly competitive market. It's very easy to fit a model to it. It's very easy to talk around that as well. I can't remember if I have it in these slides or the next, but at some point we do talk about some small way of interpreting the market without having to worry about this assumption. So for now, we just assume products can be different. They can be whatever. We're just looking at an average product being similar. That's what gives the discrepancy in, or the similarity in price. That's how you set a price for the whole market. So for like housing markets, which we're going to look at next, you would assume that this is the price per square footage or something along those lines, and you can relate everything very easily along this pretty simple price. You don't need every house to be the same. So anyways, these assumptions, they tend to be quite unrealistic. Particularly this many buyers and sellers one, and no barriers to entry and exit. To do business in any country of the world, you have to do a lot of paperwork first. You have to go through a lot of bureaucracy, and there's certainly not infinitely many sellers of a good. So these are pretty unrealistic assumptions. Why would we use them? I'm going to let you guys think about this for just a second here. I'm going to go through it. Trying to nail down the pace for this online lecture thing. Okay. I'm going to give some small pauses and then just go through. You can pause the video if you want to think more about these things. The first is that this perfectly competitive market, it represents an ideal of the economic market. It's where we want to get to. We want to have everything look like this because, okay, as we're going to show, perfectly competitive markets maximize welfare. Everyone's well-being's maximal. So it maximizes productive and allocative efficiency. These are two really important measures. Perfectly competitive markets, it's going to produce at the lowest cost. We're not going to show that in this course, but it's something that's very common to all 101 classes. You should see this, that the average total cost produced in a perfectly competitive market is as low as possible. And then it maximizes allocative efficiency. We will see this allocative efficiency. That basically says that goods in a perfectly competitive market, they're distributed to those with the highest value for goods, and they're distributed by those that have the lowest cost of producing in the good or in the market. Another reason we use these is that, well, easy to interpret. It's very simplistic. I'm going to show you in the next slide. Just a very simple graph, 2 lines on there. Now, the interpretation of that graph is not so bad, or not so easy, but it's much easier to interpret than the alternative would be. And then actually many markets do fit the, not perfectly competitive markets, but very, very close so that we could easily model the market as perfectly competitive. A useful benchmark that used to be used by the FTC, I don't know if they use it still in COVID times, but if you basically have 8 firms in a market, okay, they say this is enough, this is many, so they act as a perfect competitive market. They're not monopolistic. All right, well, I clicked through the slides already, but the next slide here, this is basically our intro, our first example here. I guess I'm going to shrink my face. Just as an example there. Our example perfectly competitive market and our housing market that we're going to use to introduce discrimination as well, because historically a lot of the discrimination against racial groups has been through the housing market. Okay. So this housing market here, we have on the y-axis our price in thousands of dollars. The units really don't matter here. We're not going to do math. We're just going to use it as an example. And on the right, we have quantity, thousands of houses sold in the market. So the blue line here, that's going to be our supply. This curve, it represents the marginal cost of home sellers. So the cost to selling one additional home for a seller of a home. And the red line here, this represents the marginal benefit of home buyers. So the benefit to selling one more home for the next home buyer. And this is going to be downward sloping. Supply is going to be upward sloping most of the time. We're actually going to break through that pretty quickly. But the idea here is the first houses that get sold, they have the lowest marginal cost to being sold. They're not the cheapest houses, they just have the lowest marginal cost. So I'm going to have you guys think about some costs that would be associated to selling a home that could be increasing as you get people that are more and more reluctant to sell their homes, basically. supply goes up. So the marginal cost of selling a home increases, although the home quality doesn't change at all. It's not that you're selling mansions on this side and hovels on this side. It's that the marginal cost of the sales itself, which could be many things, is increasing. Likewise, the marginal benefit here, the people that buy homes first, they seem to have the highest valuation of those homes they buy first. So again, just going to pause for a second or two here. I'm going to basically talk through the pauses. But you can think about what could be a marginal cost of selling, what could be a marginal benefit of buying. And I'm going to kind of reveal the answer on the next slide. So here, the marginal cost, right? It's going to increase, and that represents home sellers with maybe more sentimental value of their homes. They are attached to their homes. Maybe their children grew up in the homes. They don't want to sell it, or they like their neighbors. So they're going to be on this upper end. The ones that really, really like the neighborhood they're in, they're not going to be willing to sell. The ones that really, really dislike their neighborhood, though, they're going to be here on this lower end. They're going to have a low marginal cost of selling their home because they don't have any sentimental value there. Or just people with higher costs of moving. Maybe it's much harder for them to relocate. They have a good job that's very close to their house. They would be up here. And people that it's very easy for them to move. Maybe they have a new job that's going to pay for them to move. They're going to be down here. They're going to be the first ones to sell. So the regions on this graph represent basically those that have a hard time selling their homes and those that have an easy time selling their homes. Still the same home. Everyone's selling basically something that looks similar. And then the marginal benefit similarly has this sort of slope, and we can attach this configuration, these differences in marginal benefit of buying a home to different things. So these decreases in marginal benefit, they represent home buyers with maybe less net benefit to moving. So there's maybe little jobs available for someone down here in the area that they're moving to. And maybe there's a bunch of jobs. There's very high paying jobs for people up here. So they really, really want to move into this area. And just like with the marginal cost, it could just be that people that like where they live, they don't want to buy a new home, so they don't want to move out of their existing home. So they're down here. They don't really see much benefit of moving, so they're not going to unless it's a really, really, really good deal. And one other assumption that really isn't talked about enough, I talk about it a lot in my industrial organization class, but not really widespread discussion in economics here. That is that the buyers with the highest marginal benefit, they're going to be the first to buy in the market, and the sellers with the lowest marginal cost are going to be the first to sell. This will pretty much always be the case. Well, it's not always the case. There's a lot of markets that contradict this, but we're going to assume this is always the case as we go through this course. So why is this likely to be the case, though? Why is it likely that the people that have the highest benefit of buying a home, the highest marginal benefit of buying a home, and the highest or the lowest cost of buying a home are going to be the first to do an exchange? Could be any number of reasons for it. The answer is going to pop up here. No. I guess I didn't put the answer in here. All right. Well, they're the ones that are most looking for a goal or for the sale. It benefits these guys a lot, so it's worth it for them to put in a lot of effort to make the sale happen. Likewise, it benefits these guys a lot, so they're going to be putting in the highest effort. As I said, this marginal cost, for me, I think of it as people that really want to move. So the people that really, really want to move, they're going to be down here on the axis. The people that really, really want to move in, they're going to be up here. So they're going to be the ones that communicate first and exchange homes. Not exchange, trade homes, but this guy's going to buy the home from this guy. So that's my reason. There could be many other reasons for this. Now, let's say we set a market price in this market. That's going to be this green dashed line. I want you to think about 3 questions here. Up here in this region, the people that buy, so these buyers will buy because the marginal benefit is above the price. Are they hurt? Are they hurt or they buy in this market with this market price? Secondly, I want you to think about what are the economic outcomes for this market. So for those people in this market, what are their outcomes in economics terms, in terms of maybe dollars spent or quantity exchanged? These are what we mean by economic outcomes, and we're going to formally define that in lecture 3, which is coming up. And then what's the state of this market in general? Back to your 101 material. So 2 seconds here. All right. First quiet answer here is no, the buyers up here are not hurt in this market, even though the market price is above what you know is equilibrium price, which we'll get to in a few slides here. These guys aren't hurt. They're buying a home for cheaper than they value it. So they're actually benefiting from this transaction. They have a positive surplus there. The formal economic state of the market is that there's an excess of homes available. There's a surplus in the market. This is often called in the 101. I like to call it excess just because I don't like to mix up the words surplus here for the buyer's surplus, for the consumer surplus, and surplus for state of the markets. So I use excess. So there's an excess of homes available. That's the equilibrium, or that's the, what did I call it? State of the market. And the economic outcomes for those in the markets, what excess really translates into is that there's many sellers who listed their homes because they want to sell it at this high price, at this market price. There's many sellers here, represented by this quantity, that want to sell their home, but they can't find buyers because there's only a limited number of buyers that will buy in the market. Now, what's going to happen in this market in the long run? If these sellers that listed their homes, they can't find buyers, what happens if you try and sell your home and it doesn't sell? Well, realtors, they want to make money. So their incentive is to make a sale. And to make a sale, well, they know they have to lower the price. So they lower the price. And what this happens is some sellers that are selling their homes that have high marginal costs, the people here, they say, okay, I don't really want to sell my home for that value, so I'm going to exit the market. I'm not going to be in the market anymore. I'm not going to sell my home anymore. So they're going to pull out. And so many of them pull out such that the market reaches this equilibrium here, the crossing point of supply and demand. And that price is going to be reached through this sort of exchange process. People want to sell their homes that are selling, so they're going to lower their price. Some are going to drop out. Eventually, you're going to reach an equilibrium here where the people that want to buy are equal to the people that want to sell at whatever price. So at the perfectly competitive market price, no seller nor buyer who wants to buy or sell is neglected. They all get service. The market's completely cleared, is what's called. So that's basically our perfectly competitive markets conditions. And we're just doing sort of a refresher of your 101 here. Now, we're going to use the same example, the housing market, to motivate direct discrimination and the economic harm it does to individuals. So what really drives that equilibrium price that we showed in the previous slide is competition. It's competition between sellers. They have to sell for lower prices so they can attract buyers to buy their home. And there's also competition for buyers in that they will sometimes upsell the buy for higher, they'll bid up the price, which very commonly happens in the real estate market. So there's competition, but that competition drives the price to be what it is. If you have more seller competition, more sellers want to sell their house. If there's an excess in the markets, it's going to drive prices down, and we saw previously. So supply is going to, if you have sellers enter the markets per se, it's going to be similar to what we saw. So supply is going to shift to the right if there's more sellers in the market. And those additional sellers, they're going to compete for customers by lowering the price, and you're going to end up selling more in that market. If there's more buyer competition, it's going to drive up prices. So this is going to be a shift in demand. Demand's going to shift again to the right, but when demand shifts to the right, backwards here, it's going to increase the price. There's going to be more products offered, but higher prices, because now buyers are competing with one another. They're going to bid up one another to get the houses available. So what happens with direct discrimination is that basically a few sellers say, okay, I don't sell to black people, is the most common historical context, which we're going to explore an awful lot. By the way, I will call this group black people. I'll call whites, and then I use the word Hispanic for Hispanic. I feel like Hispanic and like Latinx just have the worst descriptive terms because, okay, not all people in South America are Hispanic. Not all people are Latin. Oh, it's a whole nightmare. I just use Hispanic. But these are the academic terms. That's why I use them. There's also some reasons I use black as opposed to African American, and that is that I think it's more descriptive. African American, you could call Elon Musk African American, for instance. And that's not really the group that we're getting at here. So we want people that have been discriminated against due to the color of their skin, due to their skin being black. And that's what we refer to as the group black Americans primarily. So what happens if a few sellers in the market decide they don't want to sell to certain groups, primarily blacks? Well, there's going to be less competition for these buyers in this market in this black home market. And when you have less competition, well, what happens is it's going to drive up price. If you have more seller competition, it's going to drive down prices. If you have less seller competition, it's going to drive up prices. And that's what we're going to show on this next slide. So it's going to drive up prices for the discriminated against group. That's going to be blacks. So looking at that same market, let's assume what we presented before was the white supply, and blacks are similar in every way. They have the same demand curve. They would have the same supply curve, except that there's some portion of sellers that are racist. They won't sell to blacks, and we'll talk about that a lot in lecture 4. This is a huge motivator for essentially why blacks were unable to accrue wealth across most of the the 20th century, 1900s, even after slavery was repealed in the 1800s, and even after Jim Crow was repealed in 1960s. So we have white supply, which basically includes all home sellers, and then black supplies, which is only the non-racist home sellers. So racists, they exit the market for blacks, but not for the whites, and that drives up basically the equilibrium price here in black for the blacks compared to the whites. Now, there is some small good news here in that the non-racist sellers, the ones that are willing to sell to blacks, they make more money than the racists. They sell their homes for higher value here because they have buyers that are willing to buy it at that price. But everyone would be better off if black buyers weren't discriminated against. It would increase the market's overall welfare by quite a bit. So this is bad news. Particularly, it's bad news for black buyers who see the squeezing out. They have to pay much higher prices for their homes in racial markets, even when the people they're buying from are not racist, and that's solely due to competition here. So it's not that these people that are selling to the blacks want to rip them off particularly, it's just that they see less competition, so they are able to increase the prices. So even non-racists will disadvantage black buyers in this market. And that's the case with all direct discrimination. The lack of competition drives up prices, and even if you're not racist, you end up selling for higher prices in this market. So this racism in the market here is going to lead to a loss of welfare. In economics, we call this a deadweight loss, and this deadweight loss has some meaning here. It represents something. Which I thought I had on the next slide, but I don't. So that deadweight loss, that's the loss trade. That's this trade that should have happened between this black line and this green line. Those homes should have been exchanged. There's some people living in this neighborhood that don't want to be in that neighborhood anymore, or at least could be better off in another neighborhood. And there's some people that weren't able to buy homes, so primarily blacks that want to live in some neighborhood. They want to maybe live in a suburb or in like a city that's near some job they want, but they're unable to get to it because the price is too high there. So these people could flip-flop. Let's imagine there's this is a scenario we're going to go over a lot in lecture 4. But let's imagine there's a white homeowner in the suburbs who gets a new job in the city. He wants to sell his home, but he needs to sell it for a certain price for it to be worth his while because he's invested time, money, effort into this home. He likes his neighbors to a degree, but he would be willing to move to the city if the price were right. Now, let's say he's in a neighborhood with one of these racial covenants that say, okay, basically you can't sell to black people. These covenants were, some of them are still in existence today, but some homeowners associations have this covenant that says, okay, you can't sell to some people. Those people primarily being black. So let's say he's in this neighborhood with this racial covenant. Okay, what does he do? Well, he can't sell it to a black person, so he's going to advertise it for a price that's high enough for him to justify moving and leaving the house behind. But it's not low enough for a white buyer to come in because white buyers are used to paying this price. So he's advertising it for some price in between these two curves, these two lines rather. So in between the black and the green here. So the white guys, they can't do it because, okay, I can get a home for much cheaper there. The black guys, they want to do it, but they're restricted. They aren't able to make that trade. So maybe a black person in the city wants to move out to the suburbs, get all the advantages that the suburbs offer. I can't remember the slide or the lecture number there, but it's one of the lectures we'll talk about is the city versus the suburbs. But they can't do it. They can't make this exchange because of this racism in the market there. And, well, yeah, people are much worse off there. So The next thing we want to talk about is what is welfare. It's the story behind the area of the graph. I guess I didn't realize I was going to talk about this in the next slide. So apologies, I forgot the order here a little bit. But that welfare, that area behind the graph, it represents mistrade or monetary loss, that deadweight loss. And this translates into economic outcomes, which are the real life stories. Primarily, these are going to be anything that leads to basically limited opportunity, less opportunity for an individual, less choice. That's going to be a negative economic outcome. And again, we formally define this in slide or lecture 3. So fewer opportunities to trade, fewer opportunities for exchange. It's going to lead to often poorer living conditions, which can lower lifespans, cause homelessness, insecurity. It can lower your chance for unemployment. Lower your chance for employment rather, and it can actually hinder your ability quite substantially to store or accrue wealth if you have these poor living conditions. Less trade for particular groups. It can limit innovation, which is one of the topics we're going to talk about. Creative destruction. Is that 2 or 3? It's coming up in the next 2 lectures. Creative destruction, innovation, and that's going to stagnate market growth, particularly market growth curated to the group that isn't trading. And as a whole, it's going to slow economic growth. As markets, they codepend. They depend on many other markets. The home market, right? Almost all employment depends on the housing market. If you want to hire workers, they need a place to live. If they can't find a place to live, they can't work. It's as simple as that. So it's going to limit the economic growth. It's going to limit all these advantageous trades, all the way down the line. Maybe you want a new like superstar employee. You hire them from the East Coast or the West Coast. You hire them from California, but they can't move because they're black. And okay, you're trying to hire them into a neighborhood that's incredibly racist and has racial covenants. They won't sell houses. That's an issue. You limit growth there, you limit opportunities. And we're going to talk a lot more about this in lecture 3, economic outcomes. But first, we're going to talk about this a little bit in The Wire. How have you seen this restriction in opportunity manifest itself in the first 2 episodes of The Wire? So we're going to have a lot to say about The Wire coming up here. But in this case, you've seen these economic outcomes, you've seen these poor living conditions manifest themselves in the housing projects that the characters in the drug cartel and the Barksdale crew primarily live. You see much worse, you see just very poor living standards in the pit where D is sent to trade, and that's where a lot of people live. A lot of, primarily black people live in that area. You're also going to see that this area is much more heavily policed, and that causes a lot of issues down the line in the series. Oh, all right. Later on, I have more stuff in The Wire, so we're going to pull that stuff later on. Usually this is a little bit easier when you have students discussing things and picking out parts that they are talking about rather than me having a monologue with myself about it. So I just sort of don't organically have that. I guess if we get enough viewers, I mean, it'd be great if you guys talk about this stuff in the comments, but I'm not hugely optimistic for this. All right, so markets. All right, real markets, they rarely meet the criteria for perfect competitive markets. There would be a lot of deviations you would have learned as an economist coming up to take this course. This course is usually a 400 level course. It's a senior course that students take. So you would know, you get to know some deviations for perfect competitive markets. The first is new monopolies. That's most common. Monopolies, it's one seller. So one seller is going to charge a premium in the market. They're going to establish what's called a monopoly rent. They're going to increase the price and restrict. They're going to increase the price and increase their profits. And they're going to do this by restricting trade. They're going to trade less. So less people get goods. Less people get houses in a housing monopoly, for instance. You could have transaction costs, such as taxes in the market. They throw a wrench in the communication between buyers and sellers, so you can't communicate on price anymore. And it's going to limit market efficiency. The need for contracts or lawyers, that slows markets. And what we just covered was discrimination that causes this issue. It takes a market that would be perfectly competitive, it would be really beneficial to everyone, And it says, okay, now all of a sudden I'm going to just no longer trade half my pool of eligible home buyers. And then you have this class of deviations for perfect competitive markets, which deals with imperfect decision makers. People aren't able to maximize their benefit at all times because it's hard to do. That's going to lead into the field of behavioral economics, which is my field. So we actually have a few lectures on that later on in the course. And there's just many, many deviations per competitive market. We're going to cover as much as we can in this course, as much as is relevant. Primarily, we're going to do a lot with discrimination, but we're going to do also a lot with economic growth. And what we're going to do in this course is we're going to take a market-based view on discrimination, discriminatory systems, which we define in the second lecture. Actually, I guess we have it on the next slide, but we're going to more formally define it in the next lecture, and their economic outcomes. And we're going to use the wire, as I mentioned in the intro to this video. The wire is going to be our case study for all these discriminatory systems that we're going to study. Now, the wire, the story of it's pretty interesting. It was written by this guy, David Simons, primarily, and it's based on real events and real people that he observed. David Simons, he was a reporter at the Baltimore Sun, primarily a reporter on police activities. He wrote many books about real life gangsters and cops, and they're all real people. So the main story in The Wire, it follows Jimmy McNulty is the main character, but also is Avon Barksdale, who's the leader. He's the what is it? Uncle to Dee. I think he's the uncle. Either that or they're cousins. Anyways, no. He's his uncle. That's right. Avon Barksdale, he's the main gangster. But then you also have Avon Barksdale when he was a kid is Bodie. One of the kids in the pit is Avon Barksdale when he was a kid. Now it's obviously this guy didn't coexist with his childhood form, but it tracks this guy's life in both his adult life and his childhood life throughout the series. And so there's a lot of focus on him. But anyways, these are all real people. It's all based on real events, rather, but portrayed by actors. So there's a lot of realism to this series, which is great. It works as a perfect case study, and David Simons is particularly an expert because he lived in Baltimore and reported on these people. Man, unfortunately, these are a little bit desync, all these references to The Wire. I sprinkled them in here and putting them all in one place. I guess that was my intention. Anyways, we have one more little thing on the Wire coming up. But first, let me just describe, or at least hash out quickly, discriminatory systems, what they are. What do I mean by a discriminatory system? Well, a discriminatory system, what I mean by that is it's a system, either financial, economic, whatnot, that harms one group, so one particular group or groups, and it's something that perpetuates itself. That discrimination gets worse over time, or at least it doesn't get any better. It doesn't alleviate itself over time. It's stuck in place because it's a system and it's an equilibrium that discriminates against one person or one group of people. I have this here. So this example I'm going to use for discriminatory systems is going to come from the very first scene of The Wire. Now, I could click this and show this on this YouTube video, but then it's going to make it hard to publish this on YouTube. So I'm going to let you guys click on this. I'll have the link down below in the description. But this first scene, the very first scene from The Wire, deals with this character snot-bugging. It's very, very interesting. So I'm going to pause a moment, let you guys handle that. Pause the video, go watch this scene, and come back. All right. Hopefully you've done that. You've watched the video here. The first thing that's relevant here is when McNulty has one of his interesting lines of dialogues. There's going to be many of them here. And that's this line, where McNulty goes off and says, oh, this guy's kid, his nose starts running. Instead of giving him Kleenex, you call him Snot. So he's Snot forever. That's his name forever. He's stuck with this basically negative name, negative connotation name. And this is directly an allegory for discriminatory systems. Instead of fixing a problem, instead of doing something very, very easy at the beginning, at the onset here, by just giving a kid a tissue, so fix the problem, you label it something negative, in this case, snot. So you can ignore it forever, or worse, hate and discriminate against it for years to come. Now, this is, of course, an allegory for the racial discrimination in America against blacks. So I'm going to let you just think a moment here about how this is very much seen where instead of fixing a problem, right, we just label it something negative and we move on. How is this related to the racial discrimination blacks have faced historically? Or maybe a problem due to long-term racial discrimination. All right. Well, there's multiple things you could have chosen here because when slavery first began, to justify that slavery, to justify this problem, instead of fixing it, instead of saying these guys are free, these are people, clearly they're people. Well, whites used Darwinism in the early days of slavery in the 1600s, which is when Darwinism was getting very big. So they used that to label blacks as an inferior race. It's primarily Darwinism. I think even earlier, before Darwin, that they used Catholicism. Crazy. Not a historian, anyways. Darwinism is the region I know, or the period of time I know. After the abolition of slavery, right? What happened is America they labeled blacks as economically disadvantaged. So for right after basically Lincoln in 1865, the blacks were struggling because they have no capital and no education because they were slaves. So they were economically disadvantaged. They're making clearly much less than their white counterparts, and they labeled this as due to blacks' personal choices, rather than acknowledge that this was the cost of basically preventing a generation, not a generation, but a group of people from accruing wealth and capital to pass on to their children for. Well, I'm going to give away an answer to one of our questions later on, but in America, it was 250 years before slavery was abolished officially. And before the Jim Crow laws were gone, it was 350 years. So America's older than America, slavery, basically, in America. And instead of acknowledging the cost of this, basically they just label blacks in this time period as economically disadvantaged due to their personal choices and move on. In this case, the labeling of economic disadvantage says we don't have to care about this group because it was their choices that led them to this state rather than acknowledge this was due to our choices. And there's an interesting quote here from Martin Luther King Jr. If black unemployment rises, it's a social problem, right? It's something due to their socialization, due to their personal choices. But if white unemployment rises, it's all of a sudden depression that the government has to do something based on it. Sorry, I'm interpreting the quote as I'm reading it. So yeah, blacks were viewed very differently from whites in their history, and they were labeled as something negative they didn't have to deal with. This also applies to the region. And this is the most common answer I get to the question is this applies to the region where blacks primarily settled in the ghetto is what it was labeled in America. Things like Harlem, things like West Baltimore, labeled as ghettos, saying, okay, we don't have to service this area. We don't have to do public services or have nice schools because it's just a ghetto. It's just a bad area. We don't have to worry about it. We don't have to think about it. And they give them this bad name so you don't have to think about it. So you can't ignore it. Oh, it's a ghetto. It's this crappy living condition that we don't have to think of. Rather than fix the problem, give people basically a strong education, have diffusion in housing situations so blacks can get access to good education for their children, for good jobs for their children. All these things you could do to fix this problem. Some of the things that the current president is looking to do, which is great. I'd love for him to get a move on with that, but it seems like everything they're doing is slow moving nowadays. Anyways, this is what this course is going to explore. What the Wire explores as well is okay, these discriminatory systems. Instead of fixing some problem, you just label it something negative and you move on. And there's many such instances of this sort of behavior that you'll see in the Wire. Now, there's another quote that's interesting from this initial conversation, and that's when I think it's Cheese. I think is the counterpart to McNulty. He becomes a character later on in the series. I'm pretty sure it is Cheese. Anyways, this guy asks, "Why'd you let him play?" Or McNulty asks, why'd you let him play? Why do you let this guy play that keeps robbing you guys blind? Every time you play, let him play craps here. And well, what Cheese responds is he says, "Oh, you got to, man. This is America." Or sorry, got to. This is America, man. Um, so I want you guys to just think a little bit about how you might interpret this. And there's many. I don't have a clear interpretation here. There's many interpretations you could have to this particular quote. So just think about what your personal interpretation is. I'll give you mine after you're done thinking about this. All right. That's well, hopefully positivity thought a little bit more about it. But anyways, my interpretation here is that well, America, it's a free country, right? You can't just give away money. You can't do something like reparations and just give money to blacks that were disadvantaged for centuries to make it better, so they can't afford living, afford living in areas that have very good jobs available, afford education for their kids. Instead, you have to sort of let the system adjust itself. In this case, I'm sort of thinking about this as black entrepreneurialism. The blacks in The Wire are very often going to be portrayed as a community, as having some rules that they live by that are different from the rest of society's rules. And they have to help one another within these rules here. In this case, they don't want to alienate, they don't want to discriminate against one of their own. They want to let him play the game. They want to give him a chance to make something of himself, to make some money here. So they don't discriminate against him. And so they want to not spread the wealth, so to say, but allow equal opportunity, allow freedom, even though this freedom wasn't echoed back to them from whites for so long. That's just my interpretation of this one. I don't have a strict interpretation here. The previous one, this is a clear allegory for discriminatory systems, but this one could go any number of ways. There's a few such examples here where I have my own interpretation, but there could be any other interpretation there. So finally, why The Wire? I know I talked about it a little bit at the beginning here, but The Wire, it's a really, really interesting series, my favorite series of all time. It studies discriminatory systems in Baltimore and how these discriminatory systems continuously repress the lower income individuals in America. It's going to do this for black and whites, even though the first season primarily focuses on the black, showing them as downtrodden in West Baltimore. The second season is going to bring in just pure low income and economic systems of repression all together. As a whole, each season it's going to cover a different discriminatory system. The first season, this is going to deal a lot with the police. We'll talk a little bit about the police in the second lecture here. We'll talk briefly about the police in the second lecture. You're going to see a lot to do with the police in the series itself, so I don't spend too much time going over those things in lectures itself. I let The Wire do the speaking for me. The second season, this deals more directly with economic systems of repression, economic discriminatory systems. Primarily, it's going to be supply chains and labor mobility. These are two really, really important issues for low-skilled workers that don't have a lot of money to move as jobs move. Hold on. I need to think before I speak so I don't give away the plot of the season. Season 3 is going to deal with politics, although it wraps up its story primarily in Season 4. Season 4 deals with education, how differences in education can lead to issues across income levels, across racial levels. And Season 5 deals with media. Now, this course only covers up to Season 4 because it's all I have to cram into a semester-long course. I can't make students watch enough episodes to get up to Season 5. But Season 5 is very, very good, and you should watch it, even though this lecture series only goes up to Season 4. Maybe I'll record extra lectures for Season 5. We'll see how popular these YouTube videos get, if they get views at all. Anyways, as a whole, the show, it presents an open-minded view, both of the police. It doesn't portray the police in any negative connotation, as well as people that are policed. It doesn't have this sort of mindset that the gangsters, the Barksdale cartel, the drug dealers are evil. It just says these are both people. They're both making choices in their own self-interest, and they're doing so in a system, in a set of systems that is designed to essentially make one group worse off than the other. And we'll see how that plays out across the 5 seasons of The Wire. And very often, in terms of intellect, in terms of ability, criminals in The Wire are portrayed as equals to the police, not like necessarily needing to be mental equals to be portrayed as equals, just to be presented in the same light. It's not like you have some evil super genius as you'd see in like a comic book movie, where that super genius, he's obviously elevated above the others because he's so smart, but he's just portrayed as everything he does is evil. There's no real good or evil in The Wire. It's just these are characters, these are people. And on both sides, they're both people making best choices or thinking they're making the best choices for themselves. And they're just doing that in sort of, well, a crummy world for one half, particularly the half that has a darker colored skin for themselves. And as you watch the series, as you go through this course, I really want you to express the same mentality to look at criminals and police as the same, both as people making choices within their constraints, making constrained optimization choices. There's no innate differences between these groups. It's just where they're born and what the situations they have to adapt to. And I believe that's the last of my slides. Yeah, so that's the last of my slides for this introductory video. I think I'll get better at these lectures. The more I do it, it's just I'm used to lecturing to an audience that responds directly, instantaneously as I'm speaking. And this course is set up to be discussion based. So this is a little bit odd, but I think it's a pretty interesting course. And I'm happy to put it up online. So I've taken the time to do that. If you do have feedback, well, I'm in the early stages here of recording these lectures. I'd love to see it. I'd love to have some comments. You could send me an email, or you could just reply or comment down below on the video. But an email is the best way to get in touch with me. You can look me up. Like I said, Professor Kazin. I'm going to just write my email here. Currently, I'm at St. Mary's College of Maryland, although that will change soon. And this is my current email. So jkkazin@smcm.edu. Professor Josh Kazin, and you can check me out. You can check out my site if you're interested. Thanks for listening, everybody, and have a good day.